Summer 1940. Britain stands alone. The Luftwaffe fills the skies, hundreds of bombers crossing the Channel every day, burning London, crushing Coventry, breaking morale by night and by day. But somewhere along England's misty coast, a line of strange metal towers hums quietly in the wind, sending invisible waves into the sky. The men in Berlin don't know it yet, but they re-flying straight into history and first digital battlefield. This is the story of how a handful of engineers, physicists, and dreamers, armed not with bullets but with radio waves, saved Britain from annihilation. Chapter 1. The Threat from the Sky. It began with a sound faint at first, like distant thunder over the English Channel. Then came the vibration, a low mechanical growl that rolled across the fields of Kent and Sussex. The summer of 1940 wasn't defined by the warmth of the sun, but by the shadow of wings. Every morning, the same grim ritual. Villagers froze, eyes tilted upward as the silver cross of the Luftwaffe glinted in the sky. Bombers, Heinkels, Dorniers, Junkers flying in perfect German formation, escorted by sleek Messerschmitts that cut through the blue like razors. Above them, Britain's survival hung by the thinnest thread of steel and courage. For Adolf Hitler, the Battle of Britain was supposed to be simple. After the fall of France, only one obstacle remained before his dream of domination: the narrow strip of water that separated him from the British Isles. Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England, depended on one thing: crushing the Royal Air Force before it could defend the beaches. And in July 1940, the Luftwaffe had every advantage. They had more planes, more pilots, more experience. The German war machine had steamrolled through Europe in months, while Britain was still rearming, still training, still burying the dead of Dunkirk. To the outside world, the outcome seemed inevitable. Hitler's empire stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean, and Britain, isolated and exhausted, was next. But Britain had one advantage the world didn't know about, one that didn't roar or explode, one that whispered through the air like a secret, invisible, silent, unseen. As the first waves of bombers appeared on radar screens in July 1940, the British command room at Bentley Priory came alive. Women of the WAF, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, moved markers across vast plotting tables. Each token represented a formation of aircraft detected miles away, long before they could be seen from the ground. Their calls echoed through the room. Bandits, 40 miles east, Angels 15, meaning enemy aircraft 40 miles away at 15,000 feet. Above them, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, head of Fighter Command, stared at the map with cold precision. He didn't need to guess where the Germans were, he knew. This was Britain's new secret weapon, a chain of radar stations stretching along the southern coast, feeding data to operations rooms faster than any enemy could advance. It was called Chain Home. And while the Germans believed they ruled the sky, Chain Home could see them before they even crossed the Channel. Every blip on the screen was life or death, a signal sent, reflected, received, interpreted, turning radio waves into seconds the warning that meant the difference between survival and destruction. For the first time in history, a war wasn't just fought with bullets and bombs, but with information. The Battle of Britain would become the first modern war of networks, where knowledge could kill and invisibility could save a nation. Chapter 2. The Man Who Heard the Future. In February 1935, inside a small laboratory at the Radio Research Station in Slough, A thin, bespectacled Scottish engineer was about to change the course of human history with nothing more than a radio transmitter, an antenna, and a flash of lightning. His name was Robert Watson Watt, and while his colleagues still thought of him as a quiet man obsessed with radio static, his ideas were already echoing far beyond the walls of his cluttered lab. Britain was afraid. The First World War had ended barely 17 years earlier, and now another one was brewing. But this time the enemy wouldn't crawl through trenches or charge with bayonets. They would fly. In 1933, Hitler had come to power. By 1934, the Luftwaffe Germany's new Air Force was training thousands of pilots. And by 1935, reports reached London that Germany was building fleets of long-range bombers capable of reducing entire cities to ashes in a single night. The British public still remembered the German Zeppelins that had bombed London in 1915. Now they feared something far worse fast, invisible death from the sky. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin had declared it bluntly in Parliament. The bomber will always get through. It was a statement that haunted every military planner in Britain. How could you stop what you couldn't see? That was the question the Air Ministry handed to Watson Watt. Rumors were spreading through Europe about a terrifying new death ray, a beam of energy that could destroy aircraft mid-air. The British wanted to know if such a weapon could exist. Watson Watt, practical as ever, ran the calculations. The energy required to fry an airplane from miles away was impossible with existing technology. But what if radio waves could be used not to destroy but to detect? He proposed something radical. Send out a pulse of radio energy and listen for echoes. If a plane passed through that beam, its metal frame would reflect the signal back. It wouldn't kill the bomber, but it would tell you it was coming. It was the birth of radar, short for radio detection and ranging. On a cold winter day in 1935, Watson Watt's assistant, Arnold Wilkins, carried out the first test. They aimed a crude radio receiver at the sky as an RAF Handley Page Hayford biplane flew overhead. The signal spiked. They repeated it, and again the invisible waves returned an echo. It worked. They had just proven that the sky itself could talk. Within months, the British Air Ministry rushed funding to Watson Watt's team. By the summer of 1936, towers began rising along the coast, skeletal giants of steel and wire, each one pulsing invisible energy into the sky, listening for whispers of incoming death. What had started as an experiment in a small radio lab was quietly becoming the most important defensive system in the world. When Watson Watt presented his findings to military officials, some were skeptical. Invisible waves? Echoes? How could you trust something you couldn't see? But one officer, Air Vice Marshal Hugh Dowding, soon to command Britain's entire fighter defense, understood instantly. If this works, Dowding said, it will be worth all the radars in the world. By 1939, as Europe slid into war, Watson Watt's invention had evolved into a chain of radar stations stretching from Scotland to Cornwall, a silent, invisible wall. Each tower could detect bombers 100 miles away. Each signal could buy the RAF a few more precious minutes. And in the coming storm, those minutes would mean everything. Chapter 3. Building the Invisible Wall. By 1939, the British coastline no longer looked like a stretch of quiet countryside. It looked like something out of science fiction. Across the cliffs of Dover, the fields of Suffolk, and the windswept marshes of Norfolk rose a new kind of fortress, not made of stone or steel, but of airwaves. The towers stood like giants' thin lattices of metal, some over 350 feet tall, strung with thick wires and humming with unseen energy. Locals stared in confusion. To them, they looked like radio masts or weather stations. Few knew that this strange metallic forest was Britain's only real line of defense. The system was called Chain Home, a name as ordinary as the miracle it performed was extraordinary. From the air, it looked simple. Towers sending out radio pulses, receivers catching echoes, operators plotting dots. But beneath the surface, it was a living organism. Every signal that bounced off a Bomber S wing traveled through underground cables to command centers miles away. There, women of the WAF, the Women-S Auxiliary Air Force, translated those flickering signals into real-time intelligence. They stood over massive wooden tables, pushing markers with long sticks, turning invisible radio reflections into bright red warnings. The information flowed like blood. Through veins from coastal radar stations to filter rooms, from filter rooms to fighter command, and finally to the squadrons waiting on runways of grass and mud. Each piece of data, altitude, speed, direction, was relayed by phone and radio faster than any bomber could fly. In an age before computers, Britain had built a digital nervous system powered by pencils, wires, and human intuition. It wasn't perfect. The radar couldn't tell friend from foe, and it couldn't track low-flying planes skimming the waves. But it gave what Britain needed most time. Those extra 5 or 10 minutes between detection and attack meant the difference between meeting the enemy in the air or watching them bomb your home. Or, by the time Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the radar network stretched across Britain's entire eastern coast, a chain of invisible eyes staring into the future. When the Luftwaffe finally came, they would find not a sleeping island, but an empire of radio waves, already waiting. Chapter 4. The Blitz begins. It started with the hum, the faint vibration of engines far beyond sight. Then came the sound that Londoners would never forget, a deep, rising drone that rolled across the night sky like a gathering storm. September 7th, 1940. The Luftwaffe had arrived. At 4:43 p.m., radar stations along Britain's southern coast caught the first echoes. Faint blips appeared on the green screens at Dunkirk, Dover, and Ventnor, a massive formation heading straight for London. The operators' voices were calm but quick. Raid detected. Strength heavy. Altitude 15,000 feet. The call raced up the chain of command. At Fighter Command Headquarters, the massive plotting table at Bentley Priory lit up with movement. Colored blocks and arrows slid across the map of southern England. Bells rang. Telephones crackled. Minutes later, airfields from Biggin Hill to North Weald came alive. Pilots sprinted across grass runways. Ground crews fueled and armed Hurricanes and Spitfires. Engines roared to life. Within moments, Britain's invisible wall radar had turned into wings of steel. As the German bombers crossed the coast, they were met by RAF fighters already climbing to intercept. For the first time in warfare, one side had seen the other coming before a single visual scout was deployed. The Germans were stunned. Every raid, every formation met resistance as if the British knew exactly where they would be. And they did. Thanks to radar, the RAF no longer had to patrol aimlessly or guess. They could conserve their precious few planes, launching only when and where they were needed. To the Luftwaffe, it felt like magic, as if invisible eyes were always watching. When night fell, the German bombing campaign transformed into terror. London burned. Factories glowed like molten rivers beneath the flames. Entire streets were reduced to rubble. But even in the darkness, the radar towers still pulsed, sending silent waves into the black sky, catching echoes of bombers invisible to the human eye. The chain home stations never slept. Rain, fog, or fire, the signals kept returning. Each reflection was a whisper from the heavens. They coming again. And every time they came, Britain was ready. Chapter 5. The Battle of the Beams. By late 1940, the war in the skies had become a game of invisible lines. The Luftwaffe no longer just fought with bombs and bullets, they fought with beams. German scientists had developed their own secret weapon, radio navigation systems that guided bombers through the night. From deep inside occupied Europe, powerful transmitters sent out narrow radio beams that crossed over British cities. German pilots simply followed the tones in their headphones, one signal for left, one for right, until the two merged into a steady hum. When they reached the intersection point, they dropped their bombs. It was precision bombing 1940s style, and for a time it worked frighteningly well. Night after night, waves of Heinkels and Dorniers glided through the black skies as if guided by unseen hands. Factories, shipyards, and neighborhoods vanished beneath the flames. The system was called Nickelbane, or crooked leg. But the British had an answer, and it came from the same man who had given them radar, Robert Watson Watt. At a top-secret facility in Dorset, British engineers tuned into the German frequencies and realized what was happening. They weren't just fighting pilots anymore, they were fighting physicists. Within days, countermeasures were deployed. The RAF began broadcasting their own fake beams, bending or spoofing the German signals off course. Entire bomber formations would follow perfect guidance straight into empty fields or the sea. The Germans couldn't understand how their infallible system was failing, but Britain had quietly opened a new front: electronic warfare. Soon came the next round. The Germans switched to more advanced systems, X-Durate and Y-Durate, which used complex timing signals to calculate bomb release points. But each time the British decoded and jammed them. What began as the Battle of Britain had evolved into something deeper, a war fought in invisible waves, between antennas and oscillators, between static and silence. Every victory in the air now depended on who could listen better, who could deceive faster, and who could make the other side's eyes go blind. The pilots never saw this battle, but it saved as many lives as the dogfights above the clouds. As 1941 dawned, Britain's cities still burned, but the balance was shifting. Radar and counter-radar had turned the tide. The Luftwaffe could still attack, but they could no longer surprise. And in a war of endurance, that single fact meant survival. Chapter 6. The Turning Point. Technology meets strategy. By early 1941, radar was no longer a secret experiment hidden along Britain's coasts. It was the central nervous system of an entire nation at war. Inside underground command bunkers, hundreds of operators, mostly women in their early 20s, sat before glowing screens, listening to the static hum of the future. They weren't soldiers, but every flicker they read, every echo they traced, guided the RAF like a sixth sense. The Battle of Britain had proven something revolutionary. For the first time in human history, technology could outthink courage. The Luftwaffe had the numbers, the experience, the aircraft. Britain had foresight. When German radar operators finally realized how effectively Britain's network worked, they tried to destroy it. Raids targeted the massive chain-home towers, those eerie steel skeletons jutting from the coastline, but the towers refused to die. Each radar station had redundant systems, and when one fell silent, another filled the gap. The structures themselves were so sturdy that even direct hits often left them standing. Engineers repaired them within hours. The invisible wall never broke. And then something remarkable happened. British radar wasn't just being used defensively anymore. It was going on the offensive. Aircraft like the Bristol Beaufighter and Mosquito were fitted with airborne interception radar, early radar sets that allowed pilots to hunt bombers in the dark. For the first time, the RAF could see at night. No more blind searching, no more guessing, just a ghostly blip on a cathode screen and then contact. The shift was psychological as much as tactical. The Luftwaffe had begun the blitz to break British morale, to crush its will to fight. But now, as radar-guided night fighters began claiming victories in the dark, the fear shifted back toward the invaders. Even Hitler's air generals began to admit the truth. The British weren't just holding on, they were adapting faster. Radar had turned war from a contest of bravery into a contest of information. And in that new kind of war, Britain was winning. Chapter 7. The Secret War of Signals. While radar watched the skies, another kind of magic was unfolding in silence, a war not of bombs or bullets, but of numbers, frequencies, and secrets. Hidden deep in the English countryside, behind barbed wire and hedgerows, stood an unassuming mansion called Bletchley Park. To outsiders, it looked like a country estate. Inside, it was the brain of the Allied world. Here, mathematicians, linguists, and cryptographers, many barely out of university, were locked in an invisible struggle against the German Enigma machine. Every day, hundreds of radio operators across Britain intercepted streams of encrypted German transmissions. Those signals, filled with jumbled letters and meaningless chatter, were carried by couriers to Bletchley. And inside those coded lines, the Allies sought the heartbeat of the Luftwaffe. Radar told Britain where the enemy was. Bletchley Park told them when they would strike. The synergy was revolutionary. Interceptors picked up German commands, codebreakers decrypted them, and radar operators confirmed the movement on their screens, the dots matching the decoded plans like clockwork. It was the birth of a new form of warfare, signals intelligence, the art of seeing without being seen. Every radar pulse and every decoded message added a new piece to the same vast puzzle. When a Luftwaffe raid left occupied France, Bletchley already knew its target. When radar stations in Dover and Ventnor picked up incoming aircraft, Fighter Command already knew who they were. It was as if Britain had built an omniscient eye over Europe, not divine, but scientific. The Germans never suspected how deep the deception ran. They believed their Enigma codes were unbreakable, their radio beams infallible, their bombers unstoppable. But by 1941, British radar and intelligence worked in perfect synchronization. One hunted the enemy in the air. The other read their minds. The combination was unstoppable. It didn't just save Britain, it set the stage for D-Day, for the liberation of Europe, and for the world of digital warfare that would follow. The age of invisible waves had begun, and from now on, no army would ever fight blind again. Chapter 8. The Legacy of Radar. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the towers still stood lonely silhouettes along the cliffs, their wires humming faintly in the sea wind. The war had ended, but the invisible waves they had unleashed would never stop moving. Radar had done more than save Britain. It had rewritten the rules of war and peace. What began as a desperate experiment on the coast of Dover became the foundation for a new technological civilization. Those same principles, sending out invisible signals and reading their echoes, would soon guide ships across oceans, planes through storms, and scientists into the stars. Within just a few years, radar evolved from bulky towers into small, powerful instruments fitted in every airliner and Navy ship. Fighter pilots could now navigate through fog. Civilian aircraft could land safely in the dark. Meteorologists discovered entire new ways to see the weather, tracing storms as they formed over the Atlantic. And in 1950, radar engineers working on advanced detection systems made an unexpected discovery: microwave radiation that could heat food. The microwave oven was born from the same science that had saved Britain. But radar's legacy wasn't the only technological, it was strategic. It had changed how nations thought about security. Information had become as powerful as firepower. In the Cold War, radar became the backbone of early warning networks stretching from Alaska to Norway, massive arrays scanning the sky for Soviet bombers and missiles. The invisible wall that once protected Britain now protected the entire Western world. Even today, every aircraft that takes off, every ship that sails, every satellite that tracks a storm owes its existence to the men and women who first listened to the echoes above the English Channel. Radar turned a terrified island into a fortress of foresight. It proved that knowledge could be a shield, that science could save as many lives as soldiers, and that sometimes the greatest weapons are the ones you can see. From the first flickering blip on a cathode screen to the global radar networks that watch over us today, the spirit of those early pioneers endures a reminder that in humanity's darkest nights, it was light we couldn't see that showed us the way. Epilogue. The light we couldn't see. As the credits of war rolled across the sky, Britain stood battered but unbroken. The men and women who once stared into flickering radar screens had become silent guardians of history. They never fired a shot. They never flew a mission. But their invisible hands guided every victory that followed. In the ruins of Europe, technology became memory, and memory became legend. The radar towers were dismantled one by one, their steel frames left to rust in the salt air. But their legacy lived on in every airport radar dish, every air traffic control tower, every weather map glowing on a television screen. Those invisible waves still move around us, echoes of a time when survival depended on seeing what others could not. A reminder that the future often hides in the smallest pulses of light. If you believe their stories deserve to be remembered, subscribe to Untold Frontlines. And if you have an idea for the next Untold story, share it in the comments. Because as long as we keep remembering, the light they found in the dark will never fade.